The sign hanging crooked above the livestock pen made everyone who passed it stop and stare. Written in crude letters on weathered wood, it read, "Buy a cow, get a hardworking Apache woman for free." It was 1885 in the Arizona Territory, and Jacob Morrison stood beneath that sign with a megaphone in his weathered hands, his voice booming across the dusty town square. "Step right up, folks. Best cattle in 3 counties, and I'm throwing in my Apache housekeeper for free with every purchase." He laughed, a harsh sound that carried on the desert wind. "She cooks, she cleans, she works from dawn till dusk without complaint." Behind him, barely visible in the shadow of the barn, stood a woman. Her name was Nate, which meant mischief maker in her native tongue, though there was nothing mischievous about the quiet dignity in her dark eyes. She wore a simple cotton dress, her long black hair braided down her back, and she looked at Jacob Morrison with an expression that revealed nothing. She had learned long ago that showing emotion to cruel men only gave them power. Jacob had purchased Nate from a corrupt Indian agent 2 years prior for the price of 3 horses. In his mind, she was property, no different from the cattle he was now selling. She cooked his meals, mended his clothes, tended his garden, and cared for his livestock while he drank whiskey and gambled away his profits in town. He never thanked her. He barely spoke to her except to bark orders. To him, she was invisible, a tool, not a person. But Nate was far from what Jacob believed her to be. Before soldiers had destroyed her village and scattered her people to the winds, she had been the daughter of a respected medicine woman. She knew the language of plants and animals, could track game through impossible terrain, and carried within her the wisdom of generations. She had survived things that would have broken weaker souls. And she had been waiting, with the patience of someone who understood that all things eventually change. The auction continued through the hot afternoon. Townspeople milled about, some laughing at Jacob's crude salesmanship, others shaking their heads in disgust. Most were too afraid of the wealthy rancher to speak against him publicly. Jacob sold 3 cows that day, but when buyers asked about the offer, he waved them off dismissively. "Changed my mind," he'd say. "Found out she's more valuable than I thought." The truth was darker. He enjoyed the power of making the offer more than he ever intended to follow through. As sunset painted the sky crimson and gold, a stranger arrived in town. He rode a paint horse, sat tall in his saddle, and his eyes held the kind of clarity that comes from walking a harder road than most. His name was Thomas Whitfield, a former cavalry officer who had left the army after refusing to participate in what he called the systematic destruction of innocent people. Now he ran a small ranch with his wife and 3 children, barely scraping by but living with his conscience intact. Thomas needed cattle. His small herd had been devastated by disease, and without replenishing his stock, his family faced a harsh winter. He had exactly enough money for 1 cow, his life savings wrapped in a worn leather pouch. When he saw Jacob's sign, something hardened in Thomas's jaw. He had seen too much cruelty in his years in uniform, had been complicit in some of it to his eternal shame. He approached Jacob with steady steps. "That sign true?" Thomas asked, his voice level. Jacob sized him up, saw the shabby clothes and the earnest face, and smirked. "Well now, that depends. You got money for a cow?" "I do." "Then I suppose the sign's true." Jacob's grin widened. He thought he'd found another fool to mock, another story to tell over cards and whiskey. Thomas counted out his money slowly, deliberately. Every coin represented a sacrifice, meals skipped, repairs delayed, small comforts denied. When the last coin clinked onto the wooden counter, Jacob's smile faltered slightly. The man was serious. "That brown and white heifer," Thomas said, pointing. "She looks healthy." "She is," Jacob confirmed, his voice losing some of its bluster. He suddenly realized he might actually have to follow through on his offensive offer. "And the woman comes with her," Thomas said. It wasn't a question. The crowd had grown quiet. Nate stood perfectly still in the shadows, her heart beating faster though her face remained calm. She had learned years ago not to hope, not to dream. Hope was dangerous. Hope could break you. Jacob's face flushed red. He was trapped by his own cruelty, caught between his greed and his bigotry. If he backed out now, he'd look like a liar and a coward. If he followed through, he'd lose the unpaid labor that kept his ranch running. His hands clenched into fists. Fine, he spat. Take them both. Good riddance to useless animals anyway. Thomas turned to Nate. For the first time that day, someone looked at her, really looked at her, as if she were a human being. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I know how this looks. I know what you must think of me. But I promise you, my family and we're not like him. You'll have your freedom. Your dignity. A place to stay as long as you need it, but you're free to leave whenever you choose." Nate studied his face for a long moment. She had learned to read men the way trackers read signs in the dust. This one's eyes held shame, but also sincerity. Still, she said nothing. She had been betrayed by kind words before. Thomas loaded the heifer into his wagon and offered Nate his hand to help her up to the seat. She ignored it and climbed up herself. As they rode away from Jacob Morrison's ranch, she kept her eyes forward, her spine straight, wondering what new form of prison awaited her next. Behind them, Jacob counted his money and congratulated himself on a good deal, never knowing he'd just lost the most valuable thing he'd ever had. The wagon rattled down the dusty road as evening deepened into night. Thomas didn't try to make conversation, sensing that silence was what Nate needed. The stars emerged one by one above them, the same stars that had watched over her people for countless generations. Nate felt the night air on her face and allowed herself the smallest moment of something that might have been relief. When they finally arrived at Thomas's small ranch house, lamplight glowed warm in the windows. The door burst open and 3 children spilled out, followed by a woman with kind eyes and flour on her apron. Thomas's wife, Margaret, took one look at Nate and seemed to understand everything in an instant. "Come inside," Margaret said gently. "You must be exhausted. Children, let our guest breathe." She shooed the curious kids back slightly. "We've got stew on the stove and a bed you can call your own. No obligations, no expectations. Just shelter and kindness, for as long as you need." Nate stood in the doorway of that small house, and for the first time in 2 years, she felt the tight armor around her heart crack just slightly. She didn't trust these people, not yet. Trust had to be earned. But as she looked into Margaret's eyes and saw genuine compassion there, she allowed herself something she hadn't permitted in years. She allowed herself to hope. The first morning, Nate woke before dawn out of habit. For 2 years, Jacob Morrison had kicked at her door at sunrise, demanding breakfast and cursing her for laziness if she wasn't already working. She lay still in the small but clean bedroom the Whitfields had given her, listening. She heard nothing but birdsong and the soft sounds of a house still sleeping. Uncertain, she rose and dressed, then quietly made her way to the kitchen. She knew how to move silently, her people had been hunters and scouts for generations. She began preparing breakfast as she had every morning at Jacob's ranch, expecting at any moment for Thomas or Margaret to appear with orders and demands. Instead, Margaret found her an hour later and gasped. "Oh my dear, you didn't have to do all this. I told you, you're a guest here, not a servant." Nate turned from the stove, confusion flickering across her usually impassive face. In her experience, white people's kindness always came with expectations attached. She waited for the real terms to be revealed. But they never came. That day, and the days that followed, the Whitfields treated her with genuine respect. They invited her to eat with the family rather than alone. They asked her opinion on matters around the ranch. They never ordered her to do anything, though she helped anyway, uncomfortable with idleness after so much forced labor. Thomas's 3 children, Sarah, 9 years old, Benjamin, 7, and little Emma, just 5, were fascinated by Nate. They had been taught by their parents to see people, not prejudices. Sarah, the oldest, began following Nate around like a shadow. One afternoon, Sarah found Nate examining the struggling vegetable garden behind the house. "Our plants always die," Sarah said sadly. "Mama tries so hard, but nothing grows right." Nate knelt in the dirt, running the soil through her fingers. She could feel what was wrong. It was too sandy, too dry, poorly positioned. These people were trying their best with knowledge they didn't have. Without a word, she began to work. Over the next weeks, something remarkable happened. Nate transformed the Whitfield ranch. She showed them how to position their garden to capture morning sun and afternoon shade. She taught them which plants grew naturally in the harsh Arizona soil and which were fighting a losing battle. She identified herbs that grew wild on their property, herbs that could heal fevers, ease pain, help children sleep through teething. She taught Benjamin how to track animals, showing him how to read bent grass and broken twigs like words on a page. She showed Emma which desert flowers were safe to pick and which would hurt tender fingers. She taught Sarah the medicinal properties of plants, passing down knowledge her own mother had given her. Thomas watched all of this with growing amazement. His struggling ranch began to thrive. The heifer he bought produced the best milk in the county. The garden exploded with vegetables. He learned from Nate how to read the land, how to work with nature instead of against it. His fences grew stronger, his water conservation improved, his livestock stayed healthier. But more than the practical help, something else was changing. The Whitfield home felt different, fuller, warmer. The children laughed more. Margaret hummed while she worked, delighted to have another woman to talk with. Thomas found himself looking forward to evenings when they'd all sit together and Nate would occasionally share stories of her people, her culture, her history. 3 months after arriving at the Whitfield ranch, Nate began to smile. It was a small thing at first, just a quirk of her lips when Emma told a silly joke. But Margaret saw it and felt tears sting her eyes. She understood what a gift that smile was, how much healing it represented. Then came the day that everything changed. A rider arrived at the ranch, breathing hard and fast. It was Nathan, a neighboring farmer, and his face was pale with panic. "Thomas. Thomas, it's my boy. Jacob fell into the ravine behind our property. His legs broke bad and he's bleeding. I can't move him alone and the doctor's 3 hours away in town." Thomas grabbed his horse immediately. "I'll come help. Margaret, gather bandages." But Nate was already moving. She disappeared into her room and emerged with a leather pouch Thomas had never seen before. "I go too," she said. Her English had improved over the months, though she still spoke carefully. They rode hard to Nathan's property. Young Jacob, just 15 years old, lay at the bottom of a steep ravine, his leg twisted at a terrible angle, blood seeping through his torn pants. He was conscious but shock was setting in, his face pale and sweaty. "We need to get him to a doctor," Nathan said desperately. "But if we move him wrong?" Nate was already climbing down the ravine. She moved with the confidence of someone who had treated injuries in far worse conditions. She opened her pouch and began working. Thomas and Nathan watched in amazement as she created a poultice from herbs and plants she'd brought, cleaning the wound with practiced efficiency. She set the leg with steady hands while Thomas held the boy still, then splinted it using branches she'd instructed Benjamin to gather. She brewed a tea from bark and roots that eased the pain from the boy's face within minutes. "She needs more," Nate said quietly. "Infection is the danger now. There is a plant, yellow flower, grows near water. I need it. The creek's a mile east," Nathan said. "But I don't know." "I'll find it," Benjamin piped up. Nate had taught him well. He returned 20 minutes later with exactly the right plant. By the time they got young Jacob back to his house and settled, the crisis had passed. The leg was set properly, the bleeding stopped, the pain managed. The doctor arrived hours later and examined Nate's work with professional respect. "Whoever did this saved this boy's leg," he said. Maybe his life. This is excellent field medicine. Nathan looked at Nate with tears streaming down his face. Thank you, he whispered. Thank you. I don't have much, but anything I have is yours. You saved my son. Nate nodded once, uncomfortable with the attention. But something had shifted inside her. For the first time since soldiers had destroyed her village, she had used her knowledge to heal instead of merely survive. She had been seen not as property, not as a servant, but as someone with value, with skills, with wisdom worth respecting. Word spread quickly through the small community. The Apache woman living with the Whitfields had saved Nathan's boy. Soon, others began arriving at the ranch, tentatively at first, then with growing confidence. A mother whose baby couldn't keep food down. An elderly man with joints so painful he couldn't work his fields. A young woman with a cough that wouldn't stop. Nate helped them all. She never charged money, but people brought gifts, eggs, flour, vegetables, cloth. The Whitfields, who had been barely scraping by, found themselves with plenty. More than that, they found themselves at the center of a changing community. One evening, 6 months after that fateful auction, Thomas found Nate sitting outside, watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of gold and purple. He sat down beside her, comfortable enough now in her presence to share silence. You know, he said eventually, when I saw that sign Jacob put up, I was so angry I could barely think straight. I bought that cow and made him keep his word because I wanted to expose his cruelty, to free you from him. I thought I was doing something noble. He shook his head. I was a fool. Nate looked at him curiously. I didn't free you, Thomas continued. You freed us. This ranch was failing. My family was struggling. We were barely holding on. But you brought life to this place. You taught us how to live in this land instead of fighting it. You healed my neighbor's children. You brought this community together. He turned to her, his eyes bright with emotion. You changed everything, Nate. You changed my life. My family's life. This whole community's life. And I want you to know, you're not just welcome here. You're family. This is your home for as long as you want it to be. Nate was quiet for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft but steady. In my language, we have a saying, it takes two to make a friendship, but only one to extend a hand. You extended your hand, Thomas Whitfield. You and Margaret. You saw me when others saw only a thing to be used. You treated me with respect when I had forgotten what respect felt like. She paused, and Thomas